Okay. Right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're delighted to be joined by Niall Ferguson, the economic historian. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute of Stanford University, and he's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Ascent of Money, which I must say is a tremendous read, one of the best economics and history books I've read for quite some time, also adapted into an award-winning documentary. He's also written many books, of course, and he's going to be joining us today to speak about the twin pandemics we have at the moment, the pathogenic and the political. So to start off with, do you want to talk about the title of the event today? What is the meaning of that? And also, do you want to give us a preview of your next book, which I'm looking forward to, Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be virtually in Cambridge, where I spent 3 very happy years at Christ's and then at Peterhouse early in my career. Like it was 1989 to 92. I shudder to think what age you all were then, if indeed you were born at all. I wanted to try to show in the past more than 12 months now that history could offer some valuable insights into the unfolding pandemic, and that if policymakers listened only to epidemiologists, they might not necessarily get their response right. Some of you might have heard of another Niall Ferguson, who spells his name in the anglicised way, Neil, at Imperial College London, whose paper published in mid-March was the basis for really quite drastic policy changes in the UK and the US and elsewhere. At the same time that Niall Ferguson was publishing, my rather less well-known work was appearing at newspapers, magazines, and also in the form of a giant PowerPoint deck that I used to circulate amongst my friends. What I tried to show beginning in mid-January, when I first was talking about the likely pandemic, was that history offers a few important insights into the way pandemics play out. I worked on and off on pandemics from early on in my career. I was a graduate student, I think, when Richard Evans published Death in Hamburg, his tremendous book on the great cholera epidemic that swept the city of Hamburg in the early 1890s. But I kept on writing about the subject. The Pity of War, a book about the First World War, talks about the impact of the Spanish influenza and the final phase of World War I. I wrote a lot about the issue when I was writing both empire and civilization, because you can't really understand the expansion of European empires until you realize that they had to find solutions to the problem of contagious tropical diseases, or they wouldn't have been able to expand. At any event, there were a couple of immediately obvious points to be made back in January and February of 2020, a time when in most Western democracies, the prevailing view was one of complacency. The first was that a pandemic of the sort that we were about to witness would come in waves. And this was extremely important when epidemiologists were telling the world that there was one curve you had to flatten. I think that idea misled a great many people, but anybody who studied the Black Death of the 1340s, or the Spanish influenza of 1918-19, or the Asian flu of 1957-58 knows that there is a wave-like character to a pandemic, and that the second or third wave can be bigger than the first. That was certainly true in 1918-19. The second point, which is the one that my title alludes to today, is that there are very often simultaneous plagues of the mind. The time of pandemic is a time of upheaval And that time of upheaval is conducive to the spread of radical ideas. I wrote about this a bit in my last book, The Square and the Tower, which is a book about networks in history. Any book about networks is partly a book about contagions, and a central theme of The Square and the Tower is that a highly networked world will be susceptible to both pathogenic pandemics, but also pandemics of ideas, of fake news or extreme views. And what I wanted to try and do in this discussion was talk a little bit about that. For example, and I'll just say a couple more things. In the 1340s, when the worst pandemic in history struck Eurasia, it didn't take long for millennialist ideas to become widespread and to actuate very extraordinary behavior. The flagellant orders, for example, would process from city to city in Germany and other parts of Europe, whipping themselves to atone for the sins of mankind in the hope of warding off further waves of plague. Not only that, but in addition to this kind of sadomasochistic religious demonstration, we saw recurrent outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence, pogroms directed against Jewish communities who were in some way held responsible for the plague. In the more recent times, 1918-19, the plague, the influenza pandemic of that era coincided with an extraordinary wave of political radicalism. It's very hard to disentangle the spread of Bolshevism and of fascism from that period of disruption that came at the end of World War I, in which Spanish flu played a key part, killed more people than the war had killed in a shorter space of time, very probably ended the ability of the German army to keep fighting the war. So in this new book, Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe, I look at disasters of all shapes and sizes and offer some general reflections on disaster as a phenomenon, trying to show that there is always a kind of interplay between what we think of as natural disasters and the political responses to them, which vary enormously and are often distorted by ideological extremes. I'll leave the opening remarks there and hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. So, of course, the first topic to discuss is COVID-19. That's been obviously the main issue this year. I'm very interested in Spanish flu because that's something which I don't think is taught that much in schools, although I certainly don't know much about it. How was Spanish flu defeated, and is there anything we can learn from that about how to defeat COVID-19? My instincts are that it was defeated through herd immunity. Is that true?
That is correct, because there was no vaccine that could be developed in that terrible time. 1918-19 was one of the worst pandemics in history. It's calculated to have killed, up to 2% or so of the world's population. At this point, COVID-19 isn't even in the top 20 of pandemics, and hasn't even overtaken 1957-58 in terms of the share of the world's population that it's killed. And 1918-19 was much worse than 57-58. The reason that 1918-19 was so devastating was that the new strain of influenza, which only got called Spanish because the relatively uncensored Spanish press reported on it, whereas the press of competent states did not really accurately report on what was happening. The Spanish flu was a new variant of influenza. There was not much resistance to it, none at all in some parts of the world. And although there were no long-haul flights in those days, it traveled the world with astonishing speed by ship. It originated, as far as we can tell, in a US Army base in Kansas, troop ships transported it across the Atlantic, and then ships took it back to the US. The war created the perfect conditions for a new virus to spread, because young men were herded together in camps and troop ships and trenches, and also were traveling great distances to the battlefields of Europe. Unlike COVID-19, which overwhelmingly kills the elderly, very unusually, pandemics in the past have not been like that. The Spanish flu actually disproportionately killed young, able-bodied people because the strength of their immune response, in fact, made their death more likely. This happened because of the way the flu virus attacked the lungs, causing a massive response, which ultimately overwhelmed the lungs in fluid. And enormous numbers of young people died as a result of this terrible disease. And there really was no pharmaceutical solution. They didn't even have antibiotics then, which meant that if people got infected in chests, they were quite likely to die. And that probably explains why the mortality rate was so very high. The final point, which is well established in the literature, is that the only response, therefore, was to use non-pharmaceutical interventions like social distancing, mask wearing, quarantining, and that was done to varying degrees. In the US, it varied enormously from city to city, and we have quite good research on how those different policy regimes worked or didn't work to limit the spread. But it's a fascinating episode to study because there are so many echoes of our own time. For example, in San Francisco, the huge controversy over mask wearing. There was actually an anti-mask league in California in 1918-19 opposing mask wearing. New York had a bad experience, partly because of the extreme reluctance of public health officials to do anything at all, really, other than stagger daily commutes. In most places, schools stayed open. There was nothing resembling a lockdown, and this is the last point to notice. One of the things that struck me writing Doom was that we had an option that didn't exist really, even in 57, certainly didn't exist in 1918, namely to put a large amount of work back in the home. That wasn't an option in the industrial societies of the 20th century. Even in 1957, half of US households didn't have telephones, or maybe it was a quarter, I forget now. In 1918, working from home wouldn't have been viable for more than a small share of the workforce. So we had the option to do things that really couldn't have been done before. And that has meant that we've been able to try to contain the spread of SARS-CoV-2 with drastic interventions in social life and economic life that wouldn't have been feasible in previous 20th century pandemics.
It seems to be a theme sometimes in history that some great periods of great catastrophe are followed by boom periods, like World War II was followed by a great prosperity in the 1950s. And obviously, at the end of World War I and the Spanish flu, there was great prosperity during the Roaring Twenties, particularly in the US. Do you think we'll see another Roaring Twenties at the end of COVID-19?
It's a great question. My good friend Nicholas Christakis at Yale published his book Apollo's Arrow last year. I think probably the first pandemic book out of the starting blocks. Nick argues towards the end of the book that he could foresee a roaring 20s by analogy with what happened in the 1920s. I'm a little more cautious than that for a couple of reasons. First, I think we will see a kind of party atmosphere in the second half of 2021 in many developed countries, including the United States, as it becomes possible, thanks to vaccination and natural immunity, to resume restaurants, bars, crowded beaches, etc. So there will be a kind of roaring second half of 2021, I think. And it'll roar a lot. This is relevant to the Marshall Society because of the enormous accumulation of forced savings and government handouts there's about $1.5 trillion waiting to be spent that US households have accumulated because of lockdowns and government programs like the CARES Act. And I think any serious economist would probably have to agree with Larry Summers that the marginal propensity to consume will be quite high. Here I consciously use John Maynard Keynes's term from the general theory, and that we will therefore get quite a spending boom, particularly in the area of services that have been kind of shut down by the pandemic. So that's the roaring part. Where I disagree is that it will be sustained for a decade. I'm not sure we would necessarily want to rerun the 1920s if the end point was 1929. But even if we did want to do that, there's a lot of reasons why it won't be like the 20s. I think that the fiscal burdens of the pandemic and indeed of the previous financial crisis are going to become a headache for governments sooner than people want to face, including even the US government. And that reminds us that the 1920s weren't roaring everywhere. And this is one of these moments when you have to remind Americans that they are not the world. The US did have roaring 20s. The UK didn't. As anybody who's studied British economic history knows, there was a savage post-war recession, 1920-21, and the economy essentially performed poorly through the 20s for a variety of reasons, return to the gold standard, etc., that we could debate. So I think that might be a far more common experience of the 2020s than Nick Christakis' nice analogy implied. And of course, for many emerging markets, it is much harder to pull off large-scale debt-financed support of your economy if you are Brazil, much less Argentina. And that's another reminder that the 1920s weren't roaring in countries that had hyperinflation. I mean, the German hyperinflation happened in 1923. I think there are going to be some inflationary episodes, probably in the southern hemisphere, to match those. So when people talk about the roaring 20s, I have to remind them what the 1920s were actually like economically. All too often, these discussions get framed by caricatures, the sort of cartoon version of history. And if we are going to rerun the 1920s, in some ways, I think we are, but it won't just be roaring. It won't just be, the Great Gatsby and Flappers and jazz. I think there's going to be a lot of the 1920s that happened in other continents, and some of it was distinctly unpleasant.
You touched on my next question there as well. When we come out of this crisis, we're going to come out with government debt levels substantially higher than they've been for a long time. What do you think history can teach us about the best way to deal with national debt?
Well, that's a question I've been working on my entire career, because my Oxford DPhil, and I have to confess to being from the other place originally, was about the German hyperinflation and argued that its origins lay in war finance and a failure of post-war policy to cope with the fiscal and monetary overhangs the war had created. Throughout the last however many years, I've recurrently written about the unsustainability of US federal government finances. It was a theme of my book Colossus back in 2003-04. And it's become an unfashionable position because in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, those who argued for fiscal consolidation became tarred with the brush of austerity. And those who said that the world should have done massive Keynesian stimulus, people like Paul Krugman, claim that counterfactually they were right. And if only they had been listened to, the US recovery would have been stronger after 2009. Part of the consequence of that logic is that the Biden administration is full of people who say we won't make the mistake that we made back then, and we're going to go large. And on top of an existing very large deficit. We'll do another $1.9 trillion of stimulus. When you think about doing that on top of vaccination, you are kind of pouring fuels on what will be quite a briskly burning fire. And it's striking that Larry Summers' piece in the Washington Post last week warned of the danger of overheating and inflation. For that to come from Larry Summers, the high priest of secular stagnation, signals that there is dissension within the Keynesian camp. And I think with reason, because a pandemic's not like a financial crisis. And all those people who use the 2008, 2009 analogy are committing a category error. Pandemics, as I said, come in waves and they end. There is an end point. And it's quite, I think, a lot nearer than people realize. Whereas financial crises can drag on, as Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart showed in This Time Is Different. They're like a sort of hangover because household balance sheets are impaired, bank balance sheets are impaired. It's very hard to get past those problems. Whereas household balance sheets have never been in better shape. People are kind of not sure what to do with all the money they've accumulated. So I think to think that we're in a kind of repeat of the post-2009 period is a great mistake that could cost the Biden administration dear. What does one do about a debt to GDP ratio higher than we have seen since World War II in the case of the United States? Well, probably stop thinking about it as a debt to GDP ratio would be a good start. In a book called The Cash Nexus, published 20 years ago, I tried to show that that is not a good measure of fiscal sustainability at all. I mean, you're taking a stock, comparing it to a flow. What you need to know is something completely different, and that is, do you have sustainability in terms of debt service? And is your real debt service cost greater than or less than your real growth rate? Because if it is greater than your real growth rate, you are doomed to nasty fiscal arithmetic. And in that situation, there aren't many ways out. In a happy deleveraging, or if that's the term one wants to use, you grow your way out of it. You get some kind of positive productivity shock, and you somehow are able to run primary surpluses, and growth will get you there. And that has happened in history. That's how the UK dealt with its post-Napoleonic debts. But if you can't do that, then the choice is actually a rather hard one between austerity measures, which can be self-defeating, as we've seen in some cases, inflation, which doesn't necessarily solve the problem if some of your liabilities are index linked, or default. And so that limited range of choices is going to start manifesting itself beginning in emerging markets, and I think in the course of this year. And I wish I could believe that we're going to get the kind of growth surprise that the world got after 1945, where there was tremendous growth and productivity grew rapidly. That really helped get countries like the US out of their wartime debt burdens. Some people, I think, cling to the belief that there is some great productivity miracle coming. My own sense is that that's an illusion, and that actually the world, the developed world certainly, is doomed to rather low productivity growth, because ultimately our service-dominated economy is not one that is going to see rapid productivity growth. And last but not least, although we all spend a colossal amount of time online, as you and I are doing right now, a hell of a lot of that time is wasted, because it's hard for me to see time spent on Facebook, especially if you spend that time at work, as productivity enhancing. And a lot of people, in fact, waste time on electronic devices rather than using them to increase their productivity. So I think the outlook is a lot less bright than it was after 1945 in that sense, and therefore that the debt problems will be much more intractable than they were in the 50s and 60s.
Thank you very much. We've had quite an interesting question from our audience. How much do you think the lessons of COVID-19 will minimize the impact of any future pandemic, or do you think short-term politics will prevent serious strategic thought?
Well, part of the story I tell in the new book, Doom, is that we always are kind of preparing for the wrong disaster. And that is because disaster comes in so many different forms And our collective political mindset is bad at coping with that kind of multifaceted set of threats. We somehow prefer to obsess about one threat. When I was at Davos in January 2020, the entire agenda was dominated by climate change. The Global Risk Report had as its top 4 risks climate-related risks, and a pandemic had already begun. And I couldn't get anybody, practically anybody, I think the Greek prime minister was a notable exception, to listen to me when I said, forget about climate change. Right now, we have to worry about a pandemic. And I think it'll really repeat itself. We'll be worried about the next pandemic. And a lot of serious people will talk a lot about pandemic preparedness. And then something completely different will come along. And writing Doom, which is a kind of general history of disaster, reminded me how many different kinds of disaster are out there waiting to ambush us. Just imagine if there was a colossal volcanic eruption. There hasn't been a really big volcanic eruption for more than 200 years. In fact, by medieval standards, we've been through centuries of low-level volcanic activity. If you had a really colossal volcanic eruption, we'd be talking about global cooling for the next 10 years. So I think the problem is not just that we're going to fail to learn the lessons of COVID-19. I'm sure we'll learn some of them, but not the right ones, just as we learned some lessons from the financial crisis, but just not all of them. I think we'll fail to learn a more general point, which is that to be resilient or anti-fragile, you need to have a kind of generalized paranoia rather than a risk management process that is excessively focused. Why did Taiwan do better? Why did South Korea do better? Partly because they'd learnt the lessons of SARS and MERS, which we had not. But mainly, I think, because if you are Taiwan or South Korea and your next door neighbor essentially wants to annihilate you as an autonomous polity, you have a generally high level of paranoia, and you are probably robust to most threats. The Taiwanese were right not to believe China or the World Health Organization when they said there was no human-to-human transmission in early January. The rest of us were like, okay, nothing to worry about. So I think generally it's better to be anti-fragile broadly rather than to be very meticulously prepared to refight the last war. And I say war because I think that is another kind of disaster that we don't think enough about. And yet, historically, it's a disaster, a form of disaster that has time and again come along to punctuate the equilibrium. It has come along to disrupt the trajectory of interest rates and inflation. And most of us have kind of forgotten what a really big war looks like. But if a really big war happened between the United States and China over Taiwan, and earlier today I was discussing that scenario with none other than Henry Kissinger, then I think we'd very quickly realize that there are worse things than pandemics for the global economy. So that's my general view. Specifically, I think the UK needs to think long and hard about how its scientific advisory structure functioned, because it wasn't as if Boris Johnson made this up on his own. He had advice from a bunch of very eminent people. But if one looks back on their performance in January, February, March, and April, it's not an edifying story. So we need to learn a little bit about what went wrong, and a proper inquiry into what went wrong in the UK and in the US would, I think, reveal that it wasn't all the fault of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump that the US and the UK did badly. There were reasons why the public health bureaucracy screwed up that we haven't really confronted publicly.
Right, we've got quite a lot of questions coming in, so I'll try and get to as many as possible. The first one, as mentioned, increased uncertainty associated with pandemics leads to increased political extremism. Based on history, once the COVID pandemic is over, will we see a return to political moderation?
It's a very good question. In 1920, Warren Harding won the US presidency on a normalcy platform. Return to normalcy was his campaign slogan. And that wasn't just a reference to the Spanish flu, it was a reference to World War I, the Red Scare, and on many other things that had had been abnormal about the late Woodrow Wilson period. And Joe Biden is the normalcy candidate, and people certainly voted for normalcy back in October, November in the United States. You probably have been told the narrative of polarization a great many times. Actually, the election result was a victory for the center ground. Trump lost, but Republican candidates did quite well, better than expected, in congressional and state level elections. The progressive left of the Democratic Party did badly. And so actually, I think the election result reflected a nationwide desire for normalcy. Those people who think the far left and the far right are going to continue to set the pace politically, the people who warn about white supremacist terrorist campaigns, I think are probably going to be wrong. I think the real lesson of January the 6th was not the strength of the lunatic right, but actually its weakness. They kind of got lucky that the policing was so bad around the Capitol, but they didn't really know what to do when they got there. So I think, in my assessment, the pandemic has been bad for the populists of both the left and the right. Example, Italy, where Mario Draghi is going to try and form a government, and the populists of the left and the right couldn't sound more demure in their kind of responses. Matteo Salvini has ceased to be the violent Eurosceptic that he was. In the UK, Brexit's done, and now it's a matter of paying the alimony, and that will be a good deal less fun than voting for Brexit was. So I think broadly speaking, a disaster like this does actually disadvantage the extremists after a while. There's a period during peak disaster when they really are emboldened, and we had madness in the streets of American cities in the summer following the death of George Floyd, and then we had madness after the election on the right. But you sense that is going to fade, actually, especially if the economy does have a terrific growth spurt this year, which seems very, very likely. I'll add one point, though. Ultimately, the US has a problem, and it's a global problem in some ways, and that is the power of big tech to dominate the public sphere, to dictate who has access to it, is too great. And it can't be healthy in a democracy for a handful of companies to have the power to essentially cancel the president of the United States while he's still in office, which is what happened after January the 6th. You can condemn Trump's conduct, as I do, very, very strongly, but there's still something funny about the fact that it was Facebook and Twitter and Amazon that shut him down. And I think the fact that our public sphere in the US is now, and in many other countries, is now so controlled by those few companies is a problem for democratic politics that we haven't yet resolved. And that is something that I worry about a lot, especially because so many liberals in the US seem to just regard it as a good thing. And if you're a real liberal, you cannot regard it as a good thing that a handful of corporations, a small number of relatively young chief executives, have the power to control access to the public sphere and exclude even the president if they want to.
I think we may have had your answer to this, but the question is, what do you think is the biggest threat to the freedoms we enjoy in the West? Is it those social media corporations?
It's not the biggest threat. The biggest threat to freedom in the world today is the Chinese Communist Party, which is in a much more powerful position at this stage of Cold War II than its Soviet counterpart was at the equivalent stage of Cold War I. Think about the strengths of the People's Republic of China. Technologically, it is certainly closer to the US than the Soviet Union was in the late 1940s. In terms of its economic scale, it is far closer. Indeed, it's potentially able to overtake the United States in terms of current dollar GDP by maybe 2030, if you believe that trends are China's friend. That was something the Soviets never got close to. The Chinese have got a game plan for displacing the US as the dominant power in the world. It is ideological, it is economic, it is military and naval, and it's technological. And if one considers the track record of the CCP, particularly since Xi Jinping came to power, it is a pretty grim one. We are seeing the creation of a totalitarian regime equipped with facial recognition technology and artificial intelligence. It's actually a more powerful state than Orwell imagined in 1984. So if China's able to win Cold War II, if it's able to extend and expand its power through the One Belt, One Road strategy and in other domains, through fintech, for example, where China is ahead of the United States, that I think would be a serious threat to individual liberty, in that the Chinese Communist Party would be able to use data that we, as Westerners living in democracies, had made available to their network platforms that could be used as evidence against us one day. So I worry kind of more about that than I worry about the what I called the FATCA companies, Facebook, Apple, Twitter, etc. Because I think ultimately there's a way of fixing the excessive power of the big tech companies in the West. It's not antitrust action, as we'll eventually realize. You just have to reform the legislation of the 1990s that essentially allows them to be both network platforms when they want to be and publishers when they want to be. That's fixable. The Chinese Communist Party is not very easily fixable. And I think a confrontation with China is kind of more or less inevitable, particularly given the course that the Biden administration is taking. So those would be my kind of probably my top two concerns. Of course, there are other threats. There is no question that the academic life of the Western world has been infected by a deeply illiberal strain of thinking, which is hostile to free thought and free speech in precisely the institutions where those things should be sacrosanct. And Cambridge is not without sin in this regard. That is a profound threat to liberty because it challenges the very concept of individual liberty by trying to superimpose on our societies notions of collective identity and collective guilt. That's a major concern to anybody at a university today. You cannot imagine how different the atmosphere is at Western universities today from the way it was when I was an undergraduate in the early 1980s, when we felt absolutely no inhibition about speaking our minds and thinking the unthinkable. Today, universities have become places where free speech is more inhibited than anywhere else in society, and I find that abhorrent. And ultimately, universities are where we educate the elite. If the elite is in one way or another intimidated into the appeasement of what, for want of a better word, my wife called wokeism, then we're in big trouble. And we won't need the Chinese Communist Party to finish off individual liberty. We'll do it ourselves.
Yes, I think Cambridge is definitely not an exception from that. We've got a few more questions about China and universities. Should universities reject funding from Chinese Communist Party affiliated entities?
Well, this is a gotcha question for an Oxford alumnus, given the story that broke this week about Oxford's accepting money from Tencent for its chair in physics. I think this is a difficult one because universities have been accepting money from all kinds of sources, Middle Eastern autocracies, for example, for many years. And it's not immediately obvious to me that we can regard Tencent as a kind of creature of the Communist Party. I think the big tech companies in China are really quite independent in some ways of the Communist Party, and that's something that Xi Jinping is trying to change. But it's still a relatively early stage in that game. And just to illustrate the point, a friend of mine a couple of years ago, a Chinese friend who works in the tech sector, explained modern China to me in the following way. He said, you have to understand it's not a monolith. There are three Chinas. There's new China, which is the tech China. He said, people like me, and many of us have US passports and spend a lot of time in the Bay Area in California. Then there's new old China. That's the state-owned enterprises controlled by the party princelings. And then there's old China, which is the unprofitable state-owned enterprises that nobody wants in the Northeast. And the divisions between these three groups are really the key to understanding China. It's a mistake, therefore, to assume that everything in China is the CCP, because in fact there are meaningful divisions, and the struggle for power between the CCP and big tech is one of the stories of the moment. I don't think that Tencent can in any meaningful way influence the teaching of physics at Oxford by giving money to Oxford. If you doubt that, ask any donors who've given money to major universities in the last 20 years, and you ask them, how much have you been able to influence the way the university has used your money? And they will universally complain that there has been no influence at all possible. So there's a big difference between a donation like this to the university's foundation and the problem that arose in Harvard, where members of the Harvard faculty, or a member of the Harvard faculty, turned out actually to be on the Chinese government payroll. That's different. And we should therefore draw a pretty clear distinction. I'm not saying we take money from anywhere. I think one looks back on donations from the Gaddafi regime in Libya with a certain horror, mentioning no institutions, but one in London does come to mind. There's obviously a need for very careful thinking when the Chinese government is so clearly pursuing a genocidal policy towards the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I think that's really going to become more and more of the issue as this year unfolds. The Western world has not talked enough about that. It is outrageous what is happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. There are concentration camps. There is a pretty clear set of measures that correspond to the definition of genocide. And under those circumstances, one must think very carefully indeed about the relationship one has with any Chinese government entity. But as I said, I think it's a little early to say that Tencent is an arm of the Chinese government.
Next question. Given China seems to have emerged from the COVID situation with an early economic rebound, do you think this will exacerbate future China-West tensions in the near future?
I think tensions will be significant, but not necessarily for that reason. Cold War II began a while back. I think the US took a while to notice that it had begun, but Xi Jinping and his advisors essentially began to pursue a Cold War strategy. The US woke up to this, curiously enough, under the influence of Donald Trump. And even the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, acknowledges that Trump's change of direction on China was right and should not be reversed by the new administration. What has happened in the last year is that Trump's analysis that China posed a fundamental threat to the United States, and the analysis of Trump's advisors, including former Secretary of State Pompeo, that the CCP is a malignant actor in the world, these things have been accepted far more widely outside the United States than was true a year ago. If one looks at the Pew Group research on opinion in developed markets, it has swung drastically against China wherever you look. Anti-Chinese sentiment is actually at a higher level in Sweden today than it is in the United States. There has been a real seismic shift of sentiment. And it's true in non-developed countries too. Think of India, where border skirmishes are just a part of a wider story of deeply deteriorating relations between New Delhi and Beijing. I think China's economic performance last year flattered to deceive. The reason they got to positive growth was A, a return to the old playbook of debt-financed fixed asset investment. B, an export boom because everybody was stuck at home in the West ordering new Peloton bikes or whatever. And I think that that's a temporary external demand shock. Next year, there's going to be a shift back to domestic services as the lockdowns end and the pandemic fades. And then China's going to be left with two serious problems. One, relatively impaired domestic consumption growth, especially amongst migrant workers. And B, the debt hangover, which Liu He, Vice Premier Liu He, has been talking about for as long as I have known him, which must be now 8 years, and they still really haven't been able to do anything about that. The private sector debt burdens of the household and especially corporate sector are crazy, and they can't continue this way. So most people in the West at the moment are overestimating China's growth potential looking ahead 10 years. People like Michael Pettis are much smarter about this. Michael has done terrific work identifying the pathologies of the Chinese growth model. When one considers the demographics as well as the debt, the headwinds are formidable. So I think China's problem is not its strength, actually. I think China's problem is its coming weakness, and the sense that the party elite has of internal weakness. That's going to tempt them to pursue a riskier foreign policy strategy than they did under the previous regime of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And I think that's where the geopolitical risk in the world is right now. The US is talking tough. The Biden administration wants to carry on being tough on China, shift from trade to human rights, but essentially maintain the tough stance. And we may be underestimating the readiness to take risk of an increasingly embattled regime in Beijing.
That's very interesting. We'll be talking about this quite a lot more in 2 weeks' time because we've got Jim Rogers joining us, who's quite a lot more optimistic about China than many others. On China as well, do you think the story of China's growth is an argument in favor of free markets or an argument in favor of government-controlled investment?
Well, China's growth story is something I've written a bit about. I was much preoccupied with it when I was writing Civilization. And it requires a certain caution to unpick it, to analyze it. Because at the core of the Chinese economy is still a 5-year plan and state-owned enterprises and very high levels of government control. But the periphery, which has until relatively recently been the main source of growth, has been a private sector that came into existence really under Deng Xiaoping and then grew like gangbusters, especially in the period after China was admitted to the World Trade Organization in 2001. And so in a way, the answer is both, because you had simultaneously a state model of heavily infrastructure-focused investment that delivered high GDP growth because that was what the local officials were told to deliver. And at the same time, you had an unplanned, technologically driven revolution taking advantage of the really quite high-quality human capital that China had built up with Jack Ma as a sort of personification of that. It's therefore not either or. The Chinese problem is clearly, and has been, as people like Michael Pettis have argued for years, that they need to wean the economy off the state-led fixed asset investment strategy and away from local government financing vehicles and that whole rickety structure of finance that lies behind the big debt mountain towards something that is more consumer-led. And they also have to ultimately dismantle some of the controls that still operate, particularly the controls in the capital account, which make the currency non-convertible. And that's really hard to do. The Bank of England did a paper now quite a few years ago, maybe 5 or more, pointing out that if you actually did liberalize the capital account, there would be so much money trying to get out of China that it would cause a global financial crisis. Chinese millionaires would love not to be long China. They would love to diversify, but they can't. So I think the Chinese model, of course, it produced the biggest and fastest industrial revolution in history, and one should not lose sight of that. But on close inspection, it's a curious hybrid. There's still a kind of Stalinist 5-year plan at the core of it, but it has wrapped around it an extraordinarily dynamic private sector. And as I mentioned earlier, there is considerable tension between those two things, between new China and new old China. And at the moment, new old China's winning. I mean, the party has the upper hand. And I think the more that's true, the greater the downward pressure on the most dynamic and healthy elements of China's economy, which are clearly in the private sector.
Right. We've got at least 2 more questions from the audience, so we'll see if we can get those done in time. We've got 2 people asking the same question. How would you compare the impact of the pandemic between developed and developing countries? And do you think that divide between the 2 countries is going to widen?
Sorry, you cut out momentarily there. Can you ask the question again?
Yeah, no problem. Do you think the gap between developed and developing countries is going to divide because of COVID-19?
The interesting thing is that the gap was narrowing. In all the debates about global inequality, the most salient fact is that it has diminished significantly over the last 20 or more years because mainly because of growth in Asia. And so the fundamental great divergence between the West and the rest, which I wrote about in Civilization, has been extraordinarily reversed. There's increased inequality within country, but really not between countries. This is a very important point that often gets lost sight of. Now, along comes the pandemic, and it starts to reopen that divide. There is clearly a very, very 2 or 3 speed world in respect of vaccinations. And we will live to regret the fact that we did not have a coherent global strategy for vaccination, because as long as we only vaccinate the Northern Hemisphere or vaccinate the developed economies and leave the Southern Hemisphere to fend for itself, we'll be dealing with new strains of the virus from Brazil and South Africa and elsewhere for potentially many years to come. I think it's also the case that the kind of measures that had to be taken in response to the pandemic were very destructive in emerging markets and developing countries that didn't have the option that existed in the US to shut down the economy temporarily and just hand people money to tide them over. I mean, you couldn't do that in India, and attempting to shut down the Indian economy caused huge social strain when the Modi government did it. So I do think that if one takes a step back, the impact of the pandemic has been to widen those inequalities between developed and less developed countries. Will that be an enduring shock? I don't know. In some ways, COVID-19 is a disease tailor-made to hurt developed countries more because of their age structure. And so the excess mortality really ought to be significantly higher in the UK and the US than in a youthful country like India or in most of sub-Saharan Africa. It's hard to know from the data, because they're not very reliable, just how badly affected India and sub-Saharan Africa have been, but it would seem not as badly, even allowing for undercounting. So it cuts both ways. I mean, I think the economic shock has probably widened the gap between the rich and the poor, but actually the pandemic has probably hurt developed countries more in terms of its human cost. I'll say one last thing. If one wants to talk about inequality, the real story is the within country inequality, which is going to be blown out even further by a combination of easy money as far as the eye can see and very poorly directed fiscal stimulus. There's a nice paper I just saw the other day, co-authored by my old friend Moritz Schulerich, looking at how monetary policy has impacted racial inequality in the United States. And it won't surprise you to hear that the effect has been enormous, because the monetary policy effect on assets, financial assets in particular, has been huge. And African Americans don't own a large share of financial assets in the United States.
I think we'll finish off with 2 questions, if possible.
Okay.
The final 2. Slightly more fun questions. Who is the smartest person you fundamentally disagree with?
I find myself in a kind of 20-year argument. It's nearly 20 years now with Larry Summers. And Larry is one of the smartest people I have ever met. And yet we frequently disagree. And I think even when we agree, we find ways to disagree, because Larry is, like me, an instinctive controversialist who thinks that truth comes from disagreement, from argument. And so we always are happily disagreeing. It's very odd that in the last 2 weeks we've actually agreed. It won't last.
Okay, the final question is, do you think we should accept that one thing we should learn from history is that we do not learn from history?
It's funny you should ask that. That's a version of Alan Taylor's, AJP Taylor's famous aperçu that the only thing men learn from history is how to make new mistakes. Nowadays, we'd say people, not men. I went to Oxford because I'd read AJP Taylor as a boy and wanted desperately to be taught by him. But in those days, there was no internet, and so I wasn't able to know that he'd left Magdalen some time before I applied. I guess that was my introduction to the importance of doing your homework. Taylor continues to be an inspiration to me because I think he was one of the most brilliant writers of history who's ever lived. And one thing that made him brilliant was his love of paradox. And really, it's just one of Taylor's throwaway lines that we only learn from history how to make new mistakes. He didn't really believe that. The truth is, as the other great Oxonian R.G. Collingwood said, we study history precisely in order to learn from it, and to learn by juxtaposing our age with the experiences of the past. So no, I don't actually think that we can't learn from history. I feel passionately that the opposite is true, and that actually history may be the only thing that we can learn from particularly when it comes to policy questions. And that's why for so long I've been an advocate of applied history. What has gone wrong in history departments in many parts of the world is that they've retreated from a concern with contemporary problems, or if they've addressed contemporary problems, they've done it by applying anachronistic value judgments to the past. It's not our business to look back on the past and say how wicked they were because there was slavery or whatever. It is our business to look at the past and try to understand what it can teach us about the present. And the lesson has to be a more interesting one than that slavery is bad, which seems, I think, a fairly straightforward proposition. So I passionately think that we can do applied history. It's what I've spent my career doing. Because I think policymakers who don't attempt to learn from history or learn from it in a half-assed way by not really studying, but just having a vague idea that, dictators are a bad thing and appeasement is a bad thing, that tends to lead to the policy disasters. So Doom is a book really of applied history aimed not just at students of history, but at policymakers, in the hope that there'll be just a few more out there trying to learn from history in the coming years.
Well, thank you very much. That's our time up. Sorry to everybody whose questions I couldn't get to, but it's great that you provoked such interest from our members. I had a big list of questions myself, and I've barely been able to start it. So thank you very much. That's been a fascinating event. I think I agree with a lot of what you say about learning from history. I think that's something very important to do. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Same to you.